So today we continue in our journey through the story of creation and redemption, the story of the whole cosmos, really, and our story within it. This is Awake Part 3, The False Solution. Last week, we started to look at what went wrong in our story. We first talked again about how humanity was birthed out of the pure love of the Trinity, the triune God of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, a divine family of love and laughter and light and friendship. We were made from them. But after our creation, there was a fall, a great fall, and this horrible lie was given that we bit into. And that original lie led us into a false identity and into the virus of sin and spiritual infancy and immaturity. So today, we're going to continue to talk about that, and I will note that this is not the fun part of the discussion, okay? This is the part where we have to take an honest look at the problem within humanity, especially as we come to understand the solution to the problem, which is what it's all about. So let me start here. Last Sunday on Easter, there was a tragedy, horrible tragedy, that occurred in Pakistan, where over 70 Christians were killed by terrorists in one moment. I'm sure many of you heard the story on the news. There were people out with their families at a local park enjoying the holiday on a crisp spring day, and out of nowhere, a bomb went off, taking the lives of numerous men, women, and children. In fact, a large majority were women and children. This is a picture that came through the news of just the aftermath from it. Now, there are no words at all to express how heartbreaking and how ugly that is. And yet, this is unfortunately one of so many tragedies that we hear about. And before I even complete this message today, somebody, somewhere, in some city or town is going to be shot or killed or overdose on a drug or lose a loved one way too early. That is the virus at work. And if you rewind the tape of humanity from today and last week on Easter, and you go back further in time, you would obviously find countless other tragedies. You would see 9/11 on that tape. Many of us have that image still in our heads. You would see the Rwandan genocide. If you kept going back, you would come to the Holocaust and to World War I and to legalized slavery and to the genocide of Native American people. Not to mention all the suicides and all the individual murders and rapes, fights and scars all along the way. Now, if you kept pressing rewind and you kept going past and through all that blood and all the heartache and all the pain and death, you would eventually come to one center point, like the touch point of a violent tornado. And at the very tip of it, at the center point, the beginning of the tape, you would find that famous moment at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So, what is that tree? What is it about that moment in time that spawned massacres on Easter and genocides on every continent and all the other tragic things that happen in this world? Well, last week we began to talk about that, but this time I want to go a little bit further because this virus is more than just a scene at a tree. The tree represents something much larger. And if I were to tell you that every single person, including every one of you, have bitten into the fruit of that tree, you might twinge at that thought, but it's true. Our teeth have been stained with the dark fruit of its juice. Now, what we said last week is that everything ultimately comes down to a lie. And a lie can produce horrible, horrible things when it's believed and embraced. That's why Jesus said that he came to reveal the truth and that the truth would set us free. But that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. The original lie that was presented to Eve and Adam was, you need to do something to become like God. Do you remember that? In other words, you are lacking, you are less than. And on top of that, your Creator is holding out on you. He's lied to you, and thus he's not that good. He's not trustworthy. So you need to do some things on your own. Eve bit into that lie, even as she bit into that tree, as did Adam. Eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was and is an act of distrust and independence. And it is also a pursuit by our own efforts to attain God-likeness, or in other words, to attain wisdom or heaven or spiritual light by our own strength. It has to do with the life of the self, pursuing God and godliness on our own instead of living out of union and trust and out of our true identity. It's a type of lifestyle that man chose from the very beginning, and though it's typified in that very moment at the tree of knowledge, it's an attitude and a lifestyle that every person took on after Adam. So this is not just about one incident in a garden that ruined everything. Understand that. That incident simply explains and showcases how we continue to ruin everything. Does that make sense? The ultimate problem is that we were designed to live out of trust and truth and relationship, interdependence. And that is why God warned Adam and all of us that engaging in a life of independence would lead to destruction. Because it's outside of our design, okay? It misses the mark, and that is the original meaning of the word sin. That word sin literally means to miss the mark. Now, let's be clear that this missing of the mark starts small. It might begin with a little bit of self-doubt here, a little bit of impatience there, but that little seed easily blossoms into things like anger and fear and rage, which eventually blossoms further into violence and self-destruction. And someone who's in a position of power, well, that can blossom even further into national corruption and even global war and genocide. But make no mistake about it, okay? The same virus staining battlefields in Pakistani parks is the same virus staining our living rooms and bedrooms. It's the same juice from the same fruit. You know, Jesus taught so powerfully that even when we speak behind someone's back or throw an insult or even harbor hatred in our hearts towards another person, we're already committing murder by doing that. So, everything I'm describing to you, from the smallest bit of hate or insult to the largest and bloodiest Holocaust, is the same virus that flows out of something the scriptures call the life of the flesh. Now, some translators, such as Dr. Brian Simmons from the Passion Translation, render this phrase as the self-life. And I like that better because some people mistakenly think that the flesh is an evil part of us. Like we have this good side and then we have a bad side, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But that is a false understanding of the phrase flesh and spirit. And that misunderstanding comes out of very old dualistic philosophies that I am not going to get into today. The flesh, as in our bodies, is not bad. Pay attention here. Our flesh is just an instrument. It's a tool that can be used for good or bad. It's neutral. There's an ancient philosophy that I will talk about called Gnosticism that the early church realized was pure heresy, false teaching. And that philosophy looks at the body as evil. Many Christians are still influenced by that teaching today, believing their body and flesh is wicked or less spiritual or something. But that's a lie. Jesus became flesh. Same word there in the Greek. Jesus became flesh to show us that our flesh is made for glory. But that's also getting ahead of ourselves. When the scriptures talk about the life of the flesh, they're talking about this self-life. And it comes down to a life of independence and pursuing God and wisdom and knowledge by the self, by self-effort and initiative. And really that comes down to that original lie of distortion and separation between us and God. It's a false identity, which is the lie that says that we are less than or incomplete. Is everyone still with me? This self-life and the false identity empowering it is where you see yourself as less than a perfectly loved and glorious reflection of a good and glorious Father. Let me say that one more time, and I'm going to put it on the screen. The original lie that leads to this life of the flesh, the self-life, is where you see yourself as less than a perfectly loved and glorious reflection of a good and glorious Father. When that lie is taken on, we begin to embody it. We begin to act less than. As we see ourselves and even God in a perverted or twisted way, wickedness is the result. The word wicked and wickedness comes from the same word as wicker. It just means something that's twisted, something that's out of alignment. Again, it's us living outside of our design. We still bear that design. We've always borne the image and the glory of God, but that image became twisted and distorted. Is everyone familiar with carnival mirrors? Funhouse mirrors. Those are the mirrors that are made out of that distorted and warbled glass, right? That when you stare into it, your reflection is very strange. It's stretched and compressed and all over the place, all at the same time. That's kind of what happened to humanity, okay? We lost sight of the glory of God and the glory in us. We began to see ourselves in a very twisted fashion, and then we started to act according to that twisted fashion. We took it on, even though it was never truly us. It was just a lie. But we started to act according to this twisted, wicked image. And it became our identity. The book of Proverbs is filled with timeless wisdom, and there is this pearl of incredible insight found in the 23rd chapter. In it, these words are written: "As a man thinks in his heart, so he is." Meaning, how you see yourself, and God for that matter, affects your actions. Because we're made for reflection. So if you're staring at the wrong thing, you're going to reflect that wrong thing, because we were designed to reflect. When we turned from God, we turned from our source of being, from the truth. And so all of this is just another way of understanding our problem. That lie of a false identity led us to think that we have to pursue perfection and wisdom and the knowledge of good and evil and all of that by our own flesh, by our own strength and might. That is the self-life. But that is a false life that leads to false actions. And those false actions are very painful. That's what we talked about in the beginning. The book of Galatians lists a few of these false actions, these things, these distortions that flow out of the self-life. Look at Galatians 5:19 to 21. Now the works of that self-life are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I also told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. So, there it is. One lie, one distorted identity at that tip of the tornado, the beginning of the tape, that led to Cain killing Abel, and brother after brother and sister after sister after sister killing and maiming one another and departing more and more from our original glory. That is the life of the flesh, which became like a disease and a virus within us. And that is what God would come to heal and restore. We said from the very beginning that God always had a plan for salvation, even before he created the world. Right now, I want to start talking about how the Trinity began to initiate that plan of salvation. It was actually already accomplished before time began, but it needed to get worked out in time and space. And that is our story now. It is the fall and redemption, or the salvation of man. Now, here's something interesting to note, okay? When we start talking about this great plan. The word salvation in the Greek is very often used as the same word for physical healing or the restoring of bodily health. Here's why that's important. God came to bring healing to the complete disease of sin. And that is what salvation is. Now, this might seem like a no-brainer to many of you, but this is an important distinction to make. Salvation is being healed of the distortion. It's a deliverance or a rescue from sin. Some people think that salvation is this get-out-of-hell insurance card that you fill out at the altar, where you're saved from an angry God. But salvation is really about the restoration of man and woman to their original glory and design. And the true spiritual life, the true awakened life, is living in that freedom and healing right now in this present life. And that will, of course, extend into the next life as well. Now, if you're a doctor and you have a patient that you discover has a cancerous tumor in a certain part of their body, and you know that it is going to eventually spread and destroy the body and kill that person, you as a doctor are not going to whip out a scalpel and tell the person to lift up their shirt without first talking to them about that problem. Right? That patient first needs to come to terms with the fact that they have cancer. Because that patient might feel totally fine, especially if the tumor is contained. If that's the case, they wouldn't let you near them with any kind of scalpel or laser until they were convinced that there was a deadly tumor inside with definite proof of it. Well, that is exactly how the plan of salvation or healing started. God, who is our great physician, first needed to expose or show mankind the cancerous virus of deception within them. Now remember something. When someone believes a lie, it is very difficult to convince them otherwise. That lie becomes truth in their minds, and we're made for truth. So we latch onto that lie when we think it's truth. I shared a story last week of a woman who shared a story with me of being told a lie from her father when she was much younger, that she was not truly beautiful. And she lived under the weight of that lie, experiencing insecurity and a lack of confidence through years and years and years of relationships. Meanwhile, it's not the truth. This woman is beautiful in so many ways, and yet she didn't see it. And so just being told the truth wasn't enough at that point to dislodge the lie from her. It's the same with humanity. God needed to do some serious long-term work in exposing the disease of the self-life, the false identity. You know, a lot of people will argue and say, why didn't God just come down out of the sky and show people the truth? Right? Why all this pain? Why don't he just wave a magic wand? Well, I want you to know that God did come down with signs and wonders and miracles galore, and we spit in his face and killed him. God came fully down as Christ, and we killed him. The issue of the lie is a deep problem. Humans are not shallow creatures that you can just wave a magic wand over their eyes. We are deep and eternal beings, just like our Father. And we needed a deep and long-term solution to restore us to the place of perfect love and freedom, which, by the way, that freedom we will enjoy for billions and billions of years, times infinity. So a couple thousand years of pre-op surgery and operation is actually quite miraculous. It's a drop in the bucket of the ocean of our eternal future. This all feels like a long time to our time-bound minds, but it's really not. But people with 3-pound brains in their head find it very easy to criticize God. And you heard that correctly, 3 pounds. That is the average size of the human brain. Men and women with 3-pound gray matter arguing with the creator of all the physics and mathematics and biology and chemistry of the universe, arguing over the way he's doing things. Well, I understand that we're emotional creatures, so our emotion guides some of our arguments, so I'm not trying to be insensitive or negative about that, but I do just want to make clear that this solution God had prepared before time itself, but it did and it does take time to work out this incredible healing and surgery of the human race. So it all started when God began to teach this immature infant humanity like a tutor teaching a child, leading us back to our original glory and love. Okay, so I need to set the stage for this first. Please know that in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to zip through about 1,000 years of biblical history. And so this is not a thorough examination of the Bible at all. But I do hope to get the main point across. And that main point has to do with the healing of the disease and this great plan of salvation that we're called to awaken to. That is the purpose of what we're doing right now. That is the whole purpose of our faith, is waking up to the gospel, the surgery, the finished surgery that was accomplished. So, before we rewound the tape, now we're going to fast forward a little bit, okay? After humanity fell into wickedness, twistedness, God began to slowly reintroduce himself. And he reintroduced himself to the world first through a man named Abram, who was a pagan worshiper, like everyone else. See, soon after our embrace of the lie and that distorted mirror, we still had an urge to worship. That was and is a part of our DNA. So since we connected or disconnected from the true God, we just made up gods everywhere else. You had the god of the wind and the god of the sand and the god of fire and the god of the moon and the god of the sun. Polytheistic worship was the first form of worship that arose after the fall because we were trying to fill that void. So God needed to reintroduce himself, and he did this through Abram. Abram became Abraham, the father of many nations, and it was through him specifically that the nation of Israel was born. It was through Abraham that God would set apart a whole people group, a whole nation who would become the most long-standing, strongest nation throughout the whole history of the world, the nation of the Hebrew people. The scriptures tell us that God chose this nation to be a light to the world. So, this nation of Israel was like an international messenger, a national priesthood in one regard, to teach the world on the outside about the lost truth. Now, Israel is no better and no worse than any other nation as far as the virus goes. All are found under that deception, both Jew and Gentile, Jews and non-Jews. But it was through this nation that God began to expose the virus. And he did that by giving them a religious law, the law of Moses. Now, this is the whole Old Testament right here in the most basic nutshell of a form. In the Old Testament, you have the nation of Israel wrestling with the law. The law was basically this glorified version of the law within our conscience, the law of right and wrong. And God said, if you will do all the things in this law, this perfect law, you will be perfect. You will be totally good. In other words, you will be righteous. Now, that word righteous is a very, very important word throughout the whole Bible. It has to do basically with our original glory and identity. We were created righteous. And God said, if you will obey this law, you will come back to that righteousness. You'll restore what was lost. Now, if anyone here, which I'm sure there's a few, are familiar with the story of the Old Testament, you would know that Israel failed to keep that law over and over and over again. And thus they never attained to the righteousness of the law. They never restored that goodness and perfection. The purpose, though, the purpose of the law, as crazy as this may sound to us today, was to be one giant, expansive lesson to humanity as a whole through the mediator nation of Israel, to convince us, to persuade us that we cannot attain righteousness and God-likeness by the flesh, by our own strength. The self-life does not work. It's a disease. It's a lie. And in fact, the striving and the self-effort through the law actually increases sin. Anybody ever go on a diet and actually find it harder to eat right once you establish that diet? Anybody ever tell a kid not to touch something and they want to touch it even more after you tell them that? Something fishy going on here. The law, any law, but especially the perfect law of Moses, what it does is it exposes and it even increases this issue of the self-life. Look at what the Apostle Paul said about the law. This is from Romans 7. Well then, am I suggesting that the law of God is sinful? Of course not. In fact, it was the law that showed me my sin. I would have never known that coveting is wrong if the law had not said, you must not covet. So, the law was like the doctor giving the patient a thorough set of enlarged x-rays, showing them the cancer within them so that the patient would recognize their need for surgery, their need for a great physician. Hence, the book of Galatians, the Apostle Paul also writes this. He says, therefore, the law has become our tutor. Remember, we said mankind fell into spiritual infancy. The law became our tutor to lead us to Christ, the great doctor who would bring us healing. See, the law was basically a long, drawn-out process showing humanity that we were not made to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Did you ever recognize that? The law is actually a type of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And giving people the law was ultimately going to teach us that all of our moralism, all of our religion, all of our self-effort and independence does not accomplish anything. In fact, it curses us. It leads to death. And so both the tree and the law bring a curse. It's the same thing. The human flesh, the body, the amazing human body, with the amazing soul inside of it, the intellect and the emotions, that in and of itself, as amazing as it is, cannot live God-like on its own. This temple here, the body, the brain, the soul, is designed to be in union. It's designed for love and for grace and truth. We need his love and we need relationship. We were made from and for that circle, that intimate circle of the Trinity. And this is what the tree of life actually points to. Remember, there was another tree in the garden that they were supposed to eat from and didn't? That tree points to the life of the Spirit, which is also the life of our true identity. And it's a life of relationship and love. So, hopefully all of this connects you back in your minds to the first message of Awake. We weren't designed to live by rules and laws and self-effort, but by love and union and interdependence. We chose to live the path of the law and self, and that led us away from our true design. And outside of our true design, we do some really, truly bad things to one another. We do, and to ourselves. We hurt one another. And sometimes this gets as bad as a whole deceived people group killing innocent families on Easter in the name of their false god. Other times, hear me, it remains as simple as friends and family blowing one another up with their tongues and backbiting. But at the end of the day, it's the same thing. And both Jew and Gentile are guilty of it. God showed us through the law that fixing ourselves and living independently by the strength of our own being, that is a false solution. But once the x-ray report is in, well, then we can begin surgery, right? Then we can welcome the healing. And that is what we are going to begin discussing for the remainder of Awake. And we're going to see that just as Adam fell into the disease, Jesus came to bring all of Adam's children out of that disease. Because there was more to the law than just pointing out the problem. Hidden within the law was also a promise of salvation. Why then was the law given? Galatians goes on to say. It was given alongside the promise to show people their sins. So, the law revealed the issue of sin, but it also served another purpose. It also contained a hope hidden within it, a promise of a healer. And now, whenever you read the Old Testament, the law of Moses, your eyes are meant to find the promise of hope within it. If you read the Old Testament or even the New Testament in order to find a way to try to become holy or good in God's sight, well, then you're missing the point. You're actually going back and eating from the tree of knowledge again. You're letting that juice come into your mouth again. But when you read the Bible through the lens of Christ and what he has accomplished, well, then you're eating the tree of life. Then you're tapping into its purpose. It is a Savior and his saving work that was planned before the foundation of the world. That's what this is all about. And that's what we're going to start to unfold. Let me pray.